Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Air Force's Global Classroom. My name is Michaela McCurry, and I work with the outreach team here at the Air Force Culture and Language Center. The month of September is the time that the Department of Defense nationally recognizes our mission in action and prisoner of war service members from previous conflicts through the National POWI Recognition Day, which is commemorated on the third Friday of September every year. We are honored to have with us Mr. Kelly McKeague, Director of the Defense POWI Accounting Agency, or DPAA, to discuss the importance of this commemoration and the mission to never leave a service member behind, as well as the support our language-enabled Airman program scholars have provided to DPAA to fulfill this mission. Mr. McKeague, thank you so much for joining us today.
Michaela, it's a privilege for me to join your program, and more importantly, as a former airman, to be amongst so many airmen, to at least be re-blued for the next 30, 40 minutes.
Absolutely, sir. So can you just start by giving us, our audience, an overview of what DPAA does?
We are the sole Department of Defense entity that is entrusted to search for, recover, and identify missing Americans from World War II through Operation Iraqi Freedom. There are over 81,000 MIAs that we still track. Now, of that, we believe 38,000 to be recoverable. In other words, they're not deep water at sea losses. So it's a daunting prospect, but we work with the service casualty offices as well as the Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory to do this important work on behalf of the nation.
Wow, that is absolutely important work for sure. So part of DPAA's mission is to provide the fullest possible accounting for missing personnel. Can you elaborate on what that means and how DPAA works to achieve that mission?
Sure. So again, these are service members and civilians who made the supreme sacrifice in a former past conflict. And as such, they were not returned home for any number of reasons. The numbers dropped precipitously. So 72,000 missing from World War II, 7,500 from the Korean War, 1,500 from the Vietnam War, and more recently in Persian Gulf conflicts, there are only 6 that are missing. The way we do this is it begins with history. In fact, this is where history and science intersect. So our historians, our researchers, our intelligence analysts, they will do the work looking through archival information, battlefield records, looking at witness accounts, sometimes even interviewing witnesses. And they'll take an area to be this large, and through their research, if they're able to narrow it down, then we will send an investigation team with which to actually survey the area. If that investigation team is able to narrow it down even further, we will send an excavation team led by an anthropologist or archaeologist to conduct that recovery work. These missions can range anywhere from 30 to 60 days, or they can extend over multiple periods of time, depending upon the complexity of the site. If human remains are recovered by the team, they come back to one of 2 forensic laboratories. In fact, the preeminent forensic human skeletal labs in the world, one at Offutt Air Force Base and one at Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam. And there, our scientists will begin the process of using 7 lines of evidence, everything from DNA to dental to anthropological, to hopefully put a name and a face to that set of remains, at which point they will be repatriated and given back to their families for a full military honors burial.
Wow. There's a lot that goes into you guys being able to fulfill that honorable mission for sure. So can you tell us how your mission to fulfill our nation's promise ties in with the Airman's Creed?
Obviously, the line that sticks out the most is never leave an airman behind, a fallen airman behind. You know, it's part of our ethos, it's part of the creed. And it's something that I think speaks to the values of this nation, that if we send men and women off to combat, we have to do everything humanly possible to bring them home. Now, I threw out the 81,000 that are missing from World War II through Operation Iraqi Freedom. You heard me describe how the numbers have come down precipitously over time. And I think that speaks to the way the services do what we call personnel recovery. And this is when a service member falls in combat today, that we do everything humanly possible to bring them home. So I juxtapose the 81,000 unaccounted for from World War II through Operation Iraqi Freedom against the 20 years of combat in Afghanistan for Operation Enduring Freedom. Not a single MIA from those 20 years of combat in Afghanistan. I find that extraordinary. And a lot of it has to do with the creeds that all services have, particularly about never leaving a fallen comrade behind. Having said that, we as a nation have an obligation, and the way we fulfill that obligation for those that did not come home and fell in combat is through what DPAA does. And that's what we are sworn to do. That's the obligation. That's the moral imperative, the sacred obligation that we have, is to take those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, Coast Guardsmen, and civilians that did not come home to at least have the chance to bring them home. But also within the creed, the other two things that strike me is the heritage and the fact that there's a tenacity that we have to employ. And that's part of DPA's work, again, for this noble mission, and to ensure that preserving the heritage of, in this case, the Air Force, ensuring that we do not falter, are two things that stand out readily about what we do, again, on behalf of all the services.
Absolutely. So you all really serve a critical purpose worldwide, and you often solicit the help of airmen in the Language-Enabled Airman program here at Air University to provide language support. Can you talk to us a little bit about how Leap Scholar support has impacted DPAA missions?
Incredibly. So when we send a team out into the field to either conduct an investigation or an excavation, we are operating in 45 different countries, literally wherever a service member fell in battle. These 45 countries, obviously, we are highly dependent upon them. We are dependent upon them for obviously getting access to the country. We're dependent upon them in working with host nation officials, and we're dependent upon them in working with the local populace, the local governments. And so for us, when we send a team out, it's usually, for an investigation team, it's anywhere from 6 to 10 people. For an excavation team, it's still only 10 to 15. Mm-hmm. Now, these teams will have multifunctional experts within them. EOD technicians, medics, communication specialists, any number of mountaineers, any number of specialties depending upon the complexity of the site. One critical aspect to every team is the linguist, because we're highly dependent upon communications that are efficient and effective in dealing with the host nation, whether it's the officials or the citizens. And so we have been working with the LEAP program since 2012. In the last few years, since 2021, we have utilized 71 LEAP scholars to help us, again, embed and augment these investigation and recovery teams with which to do the work. Just this year alone, we have a shortage of 18 Lao linguists. Again, we project out the numbers of operations, that field operations and activities we will have. We then get with Indo-PACOM and EUCOM to allow them to let them know where our shortfalls are for these specialty functional areas and tasks. And then the combatant commands will then come to the component services and ask them to source it. And so we are very dependent upon LEAP and very appreciative of the LEAP scholars that have helped us in our work. In fact, we have a new individual, an Air Force technical sergeant, who is a former LEAP scholar, assigned to our team right now as a Intel analyst researcher. But while he's been here assigned to DPAA, he was called out to assist both a special ops unit in Norway, as well as one in Denmark that was helping train Ukrainian forces, both special ops as well as SEALs, on obviously the conflict in Ukraine. And so again, we are very proud of our association and very appreciative of our association with the Culture and Language Center, as well as the LEAP program.
Wow, that is amazing. Do you have any examples of significant support LEAP scholars have provided during missions that really stood out to you? Sure.
So there was a Staff Sergeant Whited, born in Germany. He was he's a combat arms instructor. We called him up and he was assigned to an investigation team that was in Germany. They were looking at 4 crash sites from World War II. P-51, two P-51 crash sites, 1 P-47 crash site, and 1 B-24 crash site, as well as an isolated burial. And so Staff Sergeant Whited was very invaluable because as the team moved from site to site, they were in the process of, again, developing leads, pursuing witnesses, looking through church and municipal records, dealing with the town mayor, dealing with officials, and then dealing with the German populace. And so Sergeant Whited was very helpful to us from the standpoint of facilitating those communications, developing those leads, and then pursuing them as the team moved from site to site. You know, a mayor may have said, yes, I remember this individual in this town having information on that crash. And so the team would then shift toward that. And so he was very instrumental through his language skills, speaks fluent German, to be able to, again, help that team come back with more information with which to then pursue, hopefully, excavations in the future. Another one that I think is worth noting, in fact, the first Guardian LEAP scholar was Master Sergeant Lay, who was born in Vietnam, did not emigrate to the United States until she was 14. She, prior to the Space Force and Space Command standing up, Master Sergeant Lay had helped us on 4 previous missions. And again, it was extraordinary about her ability to not only help us with the language barrier, but to help us with the cultural norms that she was very familiar with, because oftentimes, especially in Vietnam, our teams are operating in very rural, very remote areas where there may be villagers that have never seen an American before. And so these teams are trying to integrate with the village simply because we are highly dependent upon villagers. Dependent upon the complexity of the site, we may employ anywhere from 20 villagers up to 100 villagers on a daily basis to help with the labor. And so Master Sergeant Lay was very instrumental, again, in both the language barrier, overcoming that, as well as assisting the team with the cultural norms of the Vietnamese people. On this last mission, her very first, and this was in 2021, her very first as a Guardian, the team was in Quang Nam province, and her ability to interact with the villagers was so profound that she took it upon herself to collect donations, whether it be money, food, toiletries, clothing from the team, as well as others, that amounted to $1,700 of goods that she then turned over as a parting gift from the team to the villagers, many of whom had to come over an hour each day to the site. And for her to present that, in my view, showed not only tremendous initiative, but also compassion for her people.
Absolutely. Wow, those are some really great vignettes that you gave. Thank you for those. And I'm sure those LEAP scholars appreciated being able to connect with you all and have an impact on those missions for sure. So how are these humanitarian efforts?
Michaela, you talked in the beginning, excuse me, you talked in the beginning about National POWI Recognition Day.
Mm-hmm.
Would you like to learn more about it?
Oh, absolutely. Yes, sir.
So you all know, you described it perfectly. It's commemorated each third Friday of September. This past one was conducted on September 15th. Bases all over the world commemorate POWI Recognition Day. It's often something that is, I've been to bases where it's a 24-hour run that airmen and civilians conduct in commemoration of the day. The day itself was actually started in 1979 by President Carter through a proclamation. And since then, presidents have issued the proclamation on the day, and then ceremonies are held all over the world. But it really goes back to 1970 when a group of Vietnam War mothers, wives, daughters began a grassroots movement that we take for granted today. In 1970, during the Vietnam War was still raging. There were POWs still in prison. There were MIAs that, again, were unknown whether or not they were in a prison camp or not. And so this grassroots movement created the flag, the iconic black and white POW MIA flag, which we all recognize readily. It flies across bases under the U.S. flag. They put together POW MIA bracelets, which many people wore in the 70s and 80s. In fact, people today, I still run across people that still have a bracelet because their service member on the bracelet isn't yet home. And so this group of wives, mothers, daughters established this movement, raised the nation's consciousness that now we take for granted that POWs, MIAs have to be readily supported. It's from that effort that DPAA's first work began. In fact, and I'll talk about this later, this is where it all began. And today it's something where POWI Recognition Day, which, by the way, is every day is POWI Recognition Day for DPAA. But it's something where, again, it reminds the nation of its obligation to honor the service and sacrifice of former POWs, as well as MIAs, and more importantly, their families who are still waiting answers. We had a ceremony on the Pentagon, at the Pentagon last on September 15th. One of the family members that was there was Brenda Brewer. Brenda Brewer's cousin is a Tuskegee Airman, which for those of you at Maxwell, 40 miles to the east is Tuskegee, Alabama. It's a storied unit. You all know the history, the valor, the service, the sacrifice of Tuskegee Airmen. There were 27 Tuskegee Airmen that were MIA from World War II. In 2018, we identified the first one, Captain Lawrence Dixon from the Bronx. Last month, we identified the second one. The second one was Brenda Brewer's cousin, First Lieutenant Fred Brewer. Brenda came all the way up from Charlotte, North Carolina to be part of POWI Recognition Day. You can imagine the joy that Brenda had from being notified that her cousin was coming home. Lieutenant Brewer was flying a P-51 Mustang and on a mission. His plane had some engine trouble. He wasn't seen. He ended up crashing in northern Italy in a village. German forces removed the body, buried the body, and then Italian villagers took parts of the plane and created a beautiful memorial. One of our researchers figured out when he saw that memorial in pictures to then do some deeper historical archival research, determined that that memorial belonged to that plane, and then figured out that the German burial, that body was then moved and tried to be identified, could not be. And so for over 70 years, the remains were buried as an unknown at the Florence American Cemetery. We exhumed that body, those remains, a year ago, and we're fortunate because of DNA, because of dental, and because of anthropological analysis, we were able to identify the second Tuskegee Airman. He will be buried next month in his hometown of Charlotte, and his cousin, as I mentioned, is absolutely overjoyed that finally her cousin is coming home.
Wow, that is an amazing story, and that really hits home for us here at Maxwell and Air University with the Tuskegee Airmen, for sure. So how do those humanitarian efforts, some of the things that you mentioned and the amazing work that you all do at DPAA, how are those a tool of engagement for our nation?
It is humanitarian in nature. It is one that countries readily recognize as, if not a responsibility of theirs because we fought as allies or because the United States helped free their country in World War II from tyranny and oppression. And because of that, these 45 countries that we work with willingly cooperate with the United States because it's humanitarian. Even China and Russia, despite the challenges with the bilateral relationship today, it's something where China and Russia look at this as a carve-out. And so we are allowed to communicate with China and Russia on losses that are in China and Russia to, again, help bring answers to families. There's only one exception, and that's North Korea. It's the only country where we have losses. And by the way, 5,300 Americans are believed to be left in North Korea. It's the only country that we don't have a dialogue with, that we don't have access to, nor that we have, again, the ability with which to conduct our operations. It's a tool of diplomacy because I think the best example to point to is Vietnam. Vietnam, this is the 50th anniversary of the end of the war this year. It's also the 50th anniversary of the POWs coming home from the Vietnam War in 1973 under Operation Homecoming. That was in 1973. It wasn't until 1980 that the United States, because Vietnam came to the United States and said, you still have all these missing and all these MIAs in Vietnam. We are willing to cooperate with you on this. In 1985, the first Americans, uniformed Americans, American military members on the ground in Hanoi looking at a crash site. Keep in mind, this was 10 years after the end of the war. It was 10 years before normalization. It was in the midst of trade embargoes, economic sanctions, you name it, that Vietnam was still under. But Vietnam recognized that it was a tool, it could be a tool of diplomacy. So they began cooperating with the United States in 1985. We had sustained joint operations that began in 1988. This is the 35th year of those joint operations. 153 of these have been conducted since 1988. Mm-hmm. And as a result, over 1,000 Americans are now home from the Vietnam War, formerly listed as MIAs.
Wow.
And I think the best example of how far we've come from those early days in 1985 with Vietnam still under trade embargoes and economic sanctions to 2023 when, as many of you know, President Biden visited Vietnam 2 weeks ago. And from that, both countries entered into a comprehensive strategic partnership, the highest level of bilateral relationships that Vietnam bestows on another country. In fact, there are only 3 countries that have this designation: Russia, China, which you can understand why, and India. The United States is the 4th. But none of that would have happened. And this relationship, this partnership that Vietnam and the United States share today across all spectrums, diplomatically, economically, informationally, are all based upon the foundational building block being their cooperation on the POW MIA mission. And I'll give you probably the most tangible aspect of how far we've come and what a difference it's made. In 2021, when we were unable to travel because of COVID, our teams were locked down. Vietnam, because we had trained 2 Vietnamese recovery teams, approached us and said, let us go do some of this work for you while you're on the sidelines. They conducted 16 unilateral excavations. 2 of them, remains were recovered. 2 of them were identified. One was a Navy commander. His mother was 101 years old when she got word that her son was coming home. The other were 2 airmen, Colonel Ernest DeSoto, who was the pilot of an F-4, and Captain Frederick Hall, who was the navigator, the weapons system officer. It was a Vietnamese recovery team that went to the site, found material evidence, found remains, and those remains were brought back to our laboratory. And earlier this spring, we identified them and returned them to their families. Colonel DeSoto was buried on June 30th at Golden Gate National Cemetery outside of San Francisco. His widow, who never remarried, Joyce, 2 sons and a daughter were there to welcome their father and their husband home. Captain Frederick Hall will be buried in Waynesville, North Carolina on October 10th, and his widow and her children will welcome him home. But again, none of this would have happened, again, if not the trust and confidence that was built, established over 35 years with our Vietnamese counterparts, with the Vietnamese government, and more importantly, with the Vietnamese citizens. You know, I mentioned that our teams deploy in remote, rural areas, and oftentimes it's with dealing with the villagers. And you can imagine there might be some animosity, there might be some hostility, simply because these people suffered greatly during the war. And yet these people, these Vietnamese people, are very warm, very compassionate, very caring. They know why we are there. They know we are looking for fallen service members to bring them home to their families. And so they cooperate readily. You know, I mentioned that some come from 2 hours away, each way from their home to the site to help us. And they do this for 45 to 60 days. And it's just an incredible dynamic when you see. And again, part of it is what the linguist is able to do to engender trust and confidence with the Vietnamese people.
Wow. Well, before we kind of sign off, we just want to thank you again and say DPAA's efforts are truly showing the highest honor and commemoration for those who have sacrificed their lives for our freedom. And we just wanted to ask, do you have any final thoughts that you want to leave our viewers with?
I would just say thank you. Thank you for stepping up when the opportunity presents itself. Thank you for the LEAP scholars whose, again, their cultural expertise their language skills are truly appreciated and valued. Like any human dynamic, people-to-people contacts, I would just offer that communication is the basis of any people-to-people contacts. But it's not just communication that will create success. It's also the ability to establish relationships, to establish rapport. And that can't happen, again, unless two drastically different peoples are able to bridge the divide, whether it be language or culture. And this is where I think the Air Force Culture and Language Center and the LEAP scholars that you all produce are incredibly valuable, not just for DPAA. I've given you examples of how tangible LEAP scholars and linguist augmentees can be to our mission. But, I can cite anything around the world where the geopolitical, the strategic, the operational opportunities are there, but can only be achieved if through the skilled language skills and cultural skills of, for instance, LEAP scholars. So again, we're very appreciative to the AFCLC and the LEAP scholars, and we look forward to engendering more opportunities. In FY24 alone, we will be employing 19 LEAP scholars in the Indo-Pacific region and 10 in the Europe-Mediterranean theater. And these are for skills, language skills that are hard to find, whether it be Hungarian, Slavic languages in Europe, whether it be Vietnamese, Khmer, or Lao in Indo-Pacific. So again, we look forward to continued partnership and relationship collaboration with AFCLC, as well as the LEAP scholars.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for joining us to discuss this such an important topic, and just to remind everyone to never leave a fellow service member behind. And before we go, we'd like to extend a special thank you to the DPAA and Air University Public Affairs teams, our tech support, Ms. Tayaja Cannon, and all of our viewers for tuning in today. So join us again next month for another episode. And remember, we are AFCLC, the Air Force's Global Classroom.